One of the most interesting things about the Wilderness Years was how it was essentially an elaborate forum debate about what Doctor Who should be played out in the literary arena. Every book in the Virgin New Adventures is like a post to that debate, where each author lays out what they think Doctor Who is, what it should be, what it shouldn't be, and what it needs to be. As with forum debates, you get elegant arguments contrasted with utter crassness. You get the people who think things were perfect in some ideal past that never was, and some people who think we should follow the new hot trends, and it goes on forever, and nobody really comes to a consensus. Today we're looking at the first book of the guy who's credited with creating one of the most oft-quoted ideas to come out of this debate. Gun versus frock. This is The Highest Science by Gareth Roberts. In some dusty, forgotten corner of the universe, the planet Sakrat sits in seeming obscurity, but deep within the ruins of a long-lost civilization, a dark secret festers, something only known as the highest science. And it's this dark secret that brings a menagerie of unlikely factions to this world. Chelonians, the most famous criminal of the 24th century, a destructive psychopath waging destruction across the galaxy. But it's time to step up his game. He wants the highest science and the destruction it could bring. But to do that, he'll first need to find Sakrat. First, he hires two master thieves, Rasheen and Clift, and a roided-up future soldier, Pastine. Together, they raid the research planet Checkley's world, stealing the Cell, an engineered biocomputer that'll be able to calculate every inch of known space to find Sakrat. However, it'll take time. Centuries, in fact. So Chelonians and his crew slip into cryosleep. However, as the Cell does its work, he begins to develop suicidal thoughts. The Chelonians, a warmongering race of giant hermaphroditic turtles, enhanced with cybernetics and chemical injections that heighten focus and rage. Their goal as an empire is to spread across the galaxy, conquering planets and wiping out whoever's living there. They see other species, especially humanoid species, as parasites, sucking up the resources the Chelonians need to spread their gardens. Late in the 57th century, a Chelonian death squad, led by General Fakrid and First Pilot Jinqua, are attacking a human settlement when a mysterious energy burst throws them across the galaxy and 3,000 years into the past, to the planet Sakrat in the 27th century. While they may not know where they are or why they were brought here, it changes nothing. This world must be conquered. The parasites that live on it must be eradicated. Ragastine is the hottest music festival in all of human space, and three teenage space hippies, Sendai, Malassi, and Rodamant, are on their way for a good time. But a space anomaly grabs and teleports their motor speeder light years away to the desolate world of Sakrat. The land is scattered with discarded trash, odds and ends transported to the planet from different worlds and time periods, including a vending machine that dispenses an odd pink drink that seems to have an effect on their mental capabilities. But what's even more interesting is that this event echoes the lyrics of one of their rock albums, a high conceptual discord from the artist Zagrat. And if the lyrics are to be believed, Malassi will soon be crowned the Wizard King, and he will do anything, even kill his friends, to gain his throne. It's a dull weekend, sometime in the year 1993, and the passengers of the 812 semi-fast train are just trying to get through their day. That's when some force snatches one of the carriages, carrying it far into the future and across the galaxy to Sakrat. From their perspective, it looks as if the world has gone apocalyptic, and one of the passengers, a man named Witcher, steps up as leader, creating a grand vision of repopulating the world. Meanwhile, two women, Vanessa and Hazel, start scavenging around on their own, discovering some extremely powerful alien weaponry. And they'll have to use it soon because something menacing is approaching the carriage from over the hill. The Doctor and Professor Bernice Summerfield. While Benny does an intergalactic pub crawl, the Doctor has picked up on a new pet project, tracking down something called a 14 flicker, a metaphysical phenomenon that warps space and time in little ways, barely perceivable unless you're directly affected by it. There's a leak in the universe, and the Doctor intends to find it and patch it up. The epicenter of the flicker appears to be on the planet Sakrat, a planet Benny knows as one of the destinations of the fraud adventuring archaeologist and occult writer Gustav Ernst, who wrote of a dark secret at the heart of the planet. Ernst was a con man, but his writings on Sakrat felt disturbed and genuine. It seems foreboding, but if they're to fix the flicker, they'll have to discover what the secret of Sakrat truly is. So yeah, as you can probably tell, there's a lot of moving parts here, and really the story is about how all of these different factions interact with each other. The titular highest science is just MacGuffin. The real tension comes from the attempts at diplomacy between factions and the inevitable violence when that diplomacy fails. Venny integrates with the hippies, the Doctor gets captured by the Chelonians, Witcher makes demands of Sheldakar, Postine and General Fakrin have a duel. It's a circus of big personalities. Sheldakar is the nearest thing the book gives to a central villain. He's the most intellectually dangerous to the Doctor, and in my first draft of this script, I called him a dark mirror of the Doctor, which, isn't really the case. It just feels like a thing to say because this is the first time the Virgin New Adventures has had a straightforward bad guy. So far, we've seen the Doctor face off against incomprehensible cosmic forces, aliens too weird to negotiate with, or massive planet-ruining corporations. This is the first time in this book series that the Doctor's just had a singular bad guy to stare down. Sheldakar is no master or Davros, he's not even a meddling monk. He's a pretty generic psychopathic villain who just wants more power, but sometimes you just gotta play the classics. Instead, the real breakout star here is the Chelonians, who provide the book with the majority of both its humor and action set pieces. On the surface, the Chelonians are a pretty basic warrior race. They believe in universal genocide and go around the galaxy slaughtering pretty indiscriminately. But that Dalek rage is contrasted by the fact that they're dorky-looking turtles. It's virtually the same comedic contrast of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the grit and violence of black and white independent comics being played out by these goofy cartoon animals. And yes, the book does reference the Ninja Turtles. But there is a bit more to these guys. For one, the fact that they're hermaphrodites results in a lot of mixed-gendered language. They use masculine pronouns and feminine titles, so phrases like, "he is my mother," would not be uncommon in Chelonian conversation. The contrast is largely for humorous effect. Thou shalt not find much commentary on gender identity here, but it does give the race some interesting texture, and also allows us for one of the most epic that time of the month jokes in science fiction history. "I am concerned for the General. His shame at the hands of the Doctor parasite seems to have unhinged him. Never before has he dared to question the censornet or insult another officer so openly." The environments officer glanced up at Fakrid's shaking shell. "Have you not realized, sir?" "What are you speaking of?" Jaquaw asked. "The time is day 20 of the occupation schedule," the environments officer continued. "We were supposed to have returned to Chelonia by now. The occupation force would have come to settle Vagoon. So, the General should have received another dose of Fetzerol to stimulate his brood cycle for his next assignment. He has not. Neither has his brood cycle been deactivated like yours or mine, or any other serving soldiers." Jinkwah turned with horror to the General. The unthinkable had happened. Fakrid had entered the time of blood. What I love about this moment is that it's not making fun of the idea that these masculine identifying aliens menstruate. It's that these aliens are so caught up with their war culture that even something normal as menstruation is given the weight of violence and madness. One other thing I want to point out about the Chelonians is that Gareth Roberts opts to subvert their culture early on. While some Doctor Who villain races get fleshed out and made sympathetic and sometimes make even full heel face turns, the Ice Warriors are my favorite example of that, it usually takes years of them being simple antagonistic monsters to scare kids into hiding behind the sofa. Roberts opts to get to that part as soon as possible, introducing the Chelonians as typical gun-toting Doctor Who monsters and giving them dimension as soon as the Doctor has a chance to interact with them. "When I had my first implant, sir," the soldier confessed, "my old woman said to me, 'Frenza,' he said, Get yourself in the army soon as you can, boy. A life of excitement and a good pension waiting for you at the end of it. And, the doctor prompted him, now interested, well, I had considered floral arrangement as a career. So, like you, sir, I didn't know which to choose. But you obviously plumbed for the army. More for the pay than any other reason, the soldier admitted. Didn't seem much of a life to me. Parading up and down, shouting and hollering, shooting down the occasional little animal. He sighed regretfully. Looking back at it now, sir, I wish I'd stuck with my flowers. I was happy as Buff positioning my stocks. The doctor smiled. Do you know, he said, it's at times like this I think there's hope for the universe yet. It's really only the Chelonian leaders, Fakrid and Jinghua, who buy fully into their jingoistic war culture. The Chelonians are presented here as a complete package, both fun as an antagonistic force, super deadly but also ham-fisted and silly, easy to conceptualize but full of a lot of narrative potential. It's no surprise that the Chelonians would be one of the more popular and recurring elements that come out of the Virgin New Adventures. And with modern television special effects budgets, they translate into New Who pretty well, and keep almost popping up. They were considered for Planet of the Dead, which I'll get to in a bit, and are name-dropped as one of the swarming forces in the Pandorica Opens.
Sontaran, full battle fleet.
Sontaran. Talk about Cross. Who stole all their handbags?
Tyrannicus, Slovene, Chelonian, Nestine, Dravin, Sycorax, Hemikov, Zygon, Atraxi, Draconian. They're all here for the Pandorica.
So we have a lot of very different factions in this book. They seem to vary wildly in terms of goals and personality, but it's their similarities that really bring to light the book's central theme. Sheldeker and his crew, the Chelonians, the space hippies, the commuters, and the Doctor and Benny, all are groups led by a man who is 100% certain they know what's going on. They know what caused all of this, and they know what they need to do. And all of them, Sheldeker, Fakrid, Malassi, Witcher, and even the Doctor, are completely 100% wrong. The highest science is not about what's at the heart of Sakrat. It's about the harm that can result from presumptions of your own intelligence. Gareth Roberts was born in 1968 and took to writing at an early age, filling out school notebooks with science fiction and horror. His first Doctor Who story was The Three Doctors, and would come to love the show during what's known as the Graham Williams era, but I'll get more into that when we get into Robert's work with the Virgin Missing Adventures. He went to study drama at the University of Winchester, and during that time developed some of the ideas that would become the highest science. Not full-blown fan fiction for him to convert later like Paul Cornell did with Time Worm Revelation, but enough stuff worked out that when Virgin made their first call for writers in the summer of 1990, he had enough of a base to build a manuscript on relatively quickly. It wasn't the smoothest submission. Peter Darvill Evans liked the ideas well enough, but found the execution lacking, and suggested Roberts run it through a few more drafts. Which is hardly all that interesting. Writing drafts is part of the day-to-day life of the writer. What's interesting is that, on the flip side of all of this, after 2 years and change of writing and rewriting The Highest Science, Gareth Roberts ended up getting a job at Virgin reviewing submissions. It isn't so much criticism as vetting. Virgin receives coachloads of unsolicited submissions, and the staff there is far too busy to make time to give the task of attention it deserves. The Doctor Who range takes its lifeblood from this intel, and as a result, Virgin is almost definitely the most welcoming publisher in the Western Hemisphere. Now, don't misunderstand me. I am not saying that it's odd that Roberts got a submissions job because he had to make a couple of goes at his first book. I'm not saying it wasn't a deserved job. But something to keep in mind is that Peter Darvill Evans was not just looking for quality writers, but fast writers. Writers like Paul Cornell were crucial to Virgin, not just because they produced great science fiction books, but because they were able to produce great science fiction books fast, getting full-length novels out in as little as 10 months. And that was only more the case now because as of February 1993, the Virgin New Adventures had switched from bi-monthly to monthly releases. What this suggests to me, and mind you, this is a bit of theorizing, is that Gareth Roberts not being quite as fast as the really fast guys, at least to start with, was offset by being super in line with what the Virgin New Adventures was trying to accomplish. Peter Darrell Evans looked at the highest science and went, "This guy gets it," and put him to work picking out other manuscripts that get it. So, what exactly is there to get? What was Gareth Roberts looking for in these manuscripts that he was reviewing? If you are interested in expressing yourself through the written word, you will almost definitely be a voracious reader of all kinds of books. Writers, from whatever background and whatever genre they work in, are interested people. They are interested in almost everything and feel the urge to express that interest through written words. If you are one of these people, then problems with writing style and the like will evaporate with experience. The most common problems are lack of originality, clumsy writing style, and shaky characterization. I don't find returning characters very interesting, and they are what fans tend to find interesting. I'm not interested in big debates on the characters of the Doctor and his companions either, and there has perhaps been too much of that. We all tend to have a differing vision of the series. The characters and what it's all about is a bit of a double-edged sword. It encourages variety, but it can make the regular characters almost schizophrenic. I worry that some of the bolder experiments with the format were not attempted within the fabric of the TV series for a number of very good reasons. So, read a lot, be interested in things, okay. Have a firm grasp on characterization that nobody seems to agree on, be original but don't experiment, okay. Now, Gareth Roberts is going to pop up a lot in this series, so I don't want to drown too much into his writing philosophies. I gotta have something to talk about when we get to Tragedy Day. But if I was to describe his stuff in one word, it would be safe. Roberts is a safe writer who produces quality work that doesn't push a lot of boundaries. And it's for that reason that he's been a consistent presence in Doctor Who since 1993. He's one of the Wilderness Years writers to transition to writing for New Who. But interesting to me is that he's the writer with the most even ratio of Wilderness Years books and television credits. Paul Cornell wrote a ton of stuff in the Wilderness Years, but only worked on 2 television stories. On the flip side, Mark Gatiss only wrote a handful of novels but is a New Who mainstay. Russell T Davies only wrote 1 book, became showrunner. Stephen Moffat only wrote 1 short story, became showrunner. Gareth Roberts is the only person you can say who wrote a lot of the Wilderness Years material and a lot of the television material, though I suppose the ratio becomes a bit TV heavy if you count his contributions to the Sarah Jane Adventures. It's the most direct line from the Wilderness Years to New Who, and one can see how Roberts' adventure and light humor style influenced the franchise, even in stuff he didn't write. The Doctor flicked a switch on the control panel of the device. A bank of lights lit up and began to emit a regular, high-pitched pulse. "Yes," he said. "Oh, it bleeps," teased Bernice. "Wonderful." The Doctor smiled. "Well, of course it bleeps. You can't build a tracking device that doesn't bleep, can you?"
Ding.
What's that?
Is a machine that goes ding.
The main influence, and most obvious influence, the highest science had on modern Doctor Who was as the backbone of the 2009 Easter special, Planet of the Dead, which Roberts co-wrote with Russell T Davies. Davies liked the image of a bunch of modern commuters ending up teleported to a desolate planet, and used Roberts' book as a starting point, though eventually so much was removed and changed that you really couldn't count it as an adaptation the same way they adapted Paul Cornell's Human Nature. Oh man, I can't wait to get to Human Nature. You have no idea. As I mentioned before, the Chelonians were considered for the special, but since they decided to film in Dubai, they opted out of giant, bulky, deadly, suffocating turtle costumes, and instead gave us some forgettable, bug-headed guys in loose-fitting jumpsuits. Alright, I've been holding off long enough. We need to talk about gun versus frock. I'm still not entirely sure the exact genesis point for this idea. It was commonly brought up in old newsgroups discussions and convention roundtables as early as 1995, but if there's some fanzine article that kicked the whole thing off, I have yet to find it. In any case, Gareth Roberts is the guy credited with the idea, and nobody in the community has contested that, so I'm going to continue under the presumption that that is the case. The idea is that Doctor Who stories fall into 2 general categories. Gun stories are serious. They tend to involve a lot of violence. They can be dark and gritty. They are quote-unquote grown up. Frock stories are the flip side of that. They emphasize fun, camp, humor, and general silliness. If that sounds vague, and kind of reductive, that's because it is. And it's a characterization that even the highest science doesn't really fit into. It has a lot of small comedic moments and one outright gut-buster when the Doctor manages to trick a couple of guys into reading a phone book cover to cover twice. But there's also a high level of graphic violence. People get eviscerated in this book. There's very few true gun stories or true frock stories in the franchise, so why is this a thing? Well, the Wilderness Years marked the time when Doctor Who largely became a fan-run franchise. Most of the people writing for the Virgin New Adventures were those who grew up with the show and were now writing what they felt the franchise should be from the perspective of an adult. And when you make quote-unquote adult Doctor Who, there is a tendency to go overboard and create something that is cynical and, well, stupid. This is an oversimplification, but a similar thing happened in the comics industry with the rise of creator-driven publishing. It resulted in shitty, dark and gritty comics that saturated the market. I don't know Roberts had that in mind, but consider that he was in a position to look at a lot of fan-written manuscripts, was looking directly at the trends the fandom might try to push. And I wouldn't be surprised if he had to flip through a bunch of shitty, dark and gritty Doctor Who stories. So at the very least, suggesting the gun and frock categories got people in the community to consider what kind of content they really wanted to read and create. It activated discussion in these communities that were now basically in charge of Doctor Who. Now, as I said in my video for Ben Aronovich Transit, I don't think R-rated Doctor Who is a bad thing, and I am far more eager for experimentation than Robert seemed to be. So many barriers were knocked down with the transition from television to books that it would be a shame to be conservative with the franchise at this point. But I am glad that Robert's got the gun and frock nugget out there to promote critical thinking among the writers. A few more notes about the highest science. First off, this is really the first time somebody besides Cornell wrote for Bernice Summerfield. She was under mind control through 95% of Transit, so that doesn't really count. Considering that this book would have originally been written with Ace as the companion, Robert's characterization of Summerfield is pretty damn excellent, showing us a Benny who is very capable of taking care of herself and also is able to put her skills in archaeology to good use. Bernice looked down at the city. Her mind was free to appreciate it properly for the first time. I can't believe this place. She shrugged. Well, it's one of the best I've seen. The Doctor followed her gaze. Ironic, isn't it? The Chelonians will probably blast it to pieces. That side looks older, remarked Bernice, pointing out a further quarter of the city. The spires resemble those of the temple. The Doctor peered in the direction she had indicated. Yes, there seems to be a lot of triumphal arches, which would suggest regular ceremonial occasions, possibly victory parades. And yet, Bernice continued, the nearer sections seem to be much less ordered, the rational street grid replaced by narrow alleys between various tacked-on blocks. The Doctor nodded, intrigued. You're suggesting a slow social reversal rather than the legendary toppled empire? Bernice shrugged. Could be. War, disease, or climatic change could account for such a throwback, although the additional buildings would suggest population growth rather than loss, which argues against those possibilities. The Doctor stared at her silently for a few seconds. Bernice, you're a pleasure to know, he said finally. As for Robert's take on the Seventh Doctor, it isn't his favorite version of the character, but rather than just ignoring his characterization like John Peel or making him all withdrawn like Mark Gatiss, Roberts lets the Seventh Doctor be the Seventh Doctor, but instead puts him in a situation where being the Seventh Doctor is a disadvantage. The Doctor shuffled the cards and cut the deck. He would have preferred chess, but Sheldakir could not provide a board, and they both disliked playing on a computer grid. Besides, the card game reflected his present situation well. Instead of his usual behind-the-scenes stage management of pawns and other pieces, he was confronted by an array of unpredictable variables. What was worse, he could not be sure of his opponent's moves or what their outcome might be. His only choice at present was to wait for the right moment to play his hand. The game continued. Essentially, Roberts goes, okay, so the Doctor is now very good at manipulating people and seeing the big picture and planning things out ahead of time. He's the chess master. Okay, but if we're going to add that to his characterization, we should subtract something to balance it out. Namely, his ability to improvise solutions on the spot. Well, not completely. That phone book thing was a good example of some classic on-the-spot problem solving, but he still isn't as capable in that department as some of his previous incarnations had been. I think this is a fair and very interesting trade-off, a good weakness for this version of the character, and perfect about this story of hubris. These 5 leaders, all of them fail because they are so sure, so 100% sure they know what is going on and what needs to be done. The Doctor is just the one who fails the least by being able to admit his shortcomings. He doesn't really save the day. At the end, there's a major confrontation between the Chelonians and the commuters, and the only thing the Doctor can do about it is put them in a time bubble, freeze them in time, and hope he can come up with a solution later. This situation is so chaotic that the Doctor, the guy who's on top of everything, can do nothing but put the situation on his to-do list. If I had one significant criticism to levy at this book, it just has too many moving parts. I know that Roberts wanted to create a situation too complicated for the Doctor, but things start to drag when you're 110 pages in and the book is still introducing important named characters and factions. I think you could have shaved one of them off without losing the theming and intensity of the plot. I probably would have gotten rid of the commuters. They arguably contribute the least. Sure, that's the faction that inspired Planet of the Dead, but well, let's be honest, how many of us would really miss Planet of the Dead? Outside of that, this is a solid, fun book. I've often seen it labeled as a comedy book, which is odd. There's a good amount of humor to be found here, mostly from the Chelonians, but it's not like Roberts wrote a farce. This is a violent story with some really sadistic characters. It is more gun than frock, if you will. Which is not to say that it's unimpressive. As first novels go, this is pretty great. I love how the book starts with these massive, universe-threatening stakes. It starts as a plot-driven narrative and then gradually evolves into a more personal, character-driven story about want and hubris. It's nice to have a capital B bad guy for the Doctor to face off against in Sheldiker, though he wouldn't have been interesting enough to carry the book by himself. Thankfully, he doesn't have to, and the Chelonians are a fantastic addition to the Doctor Who mythos. This is a pretty decent starter book. There's very little in the way of references to previous stories, so new readers who may not be as familiar with this decade-spanning franchise won't feel lost. It's also another Virgin New Adventures to get adapted into a Big Finish audio play. Once again, I have not listened to it because Big Finish is just not something I can really budget into my life at the moment. This out-of-print book is actually cheaper than the Big Finish show right now. The Highest Science is fun, exciting, well-executed, and accessible. You really can't ask for anything more. Next time, I don't know. Like, I've read this book twice, and I still don't know what's going on. It's got William Blake in it, so there's that.